Good afternoon, welcome. If you're sitting so far up that you're starting to get dizzy from the elevation, you could come a little bit closer because no one will spit at you or hurt you in any way. So do feel welcome to come closer, not obliged. Let me introduce you this afternoon. Our session is about screen time and development, the updates in research and the impacts that screen time has in children and their families. Today we're going to be hearing from Angie Neal. She is a speech and language pathology consultant with the South Carolina Department of Education. So make yourselves comfortable, be ready for some awesome information, and at the end we'll do the question and answer. I think again we are going to ask people to come down to the microphone, and that's because all the sessions are being recorded and will later be available on our website. So we want to be sure that people hear the questions and not just the answers. So just keep that in mind. Oh, and if you need continuing education units and you're not sure how to do that, talk to me afterward.
All right, so I'm getting started here. So just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. So yes, I am a speech language pathologist. I have been at the State Department of Education for almost 3 years. Prior to that, I was in the schools for about 15 years. And then even before that, I worked for Kinetics. Do we have any of the outpatient peds folks here from Kinetics? No? Okay, so I worked at outpatient peds. But what I really got interested and started in this topic because when I was in the schools, I would say maybe 7 to 8 years ago, we started getting more and more referrals for kindergarten students. And these were not referrals for kids who were having difficulty with their R's and S's. These were kids that were having difficulty acclimating to a classroom and learning with a group of other children. And so I started doing the research there. So long story short, I ended up doing this presentation March 19th. No, well, let's see, what was it? Hold on, let me get the exact date. Yeah, March 13th. March 1st, 2019. I gave this presentation March 1st, 2019. What happened on March 13th, 2019? Everything shut down. So the screen time, lots of different things were impacted as a result of that. One of the things that I'll be sharing too is an impact of a 10-year longitudinal study that looked at the impact of conversation and how that was impacted by the pandemic. So I want to be sure and share that. The other thing I'm going to share is related to the increase in screen time and autism. Real quick, my disclosures are, I was given a discounted rate to attend this. I am a member of the Ashland School Issues Advisory Board, the State Education Agency's Communications Disability Council Board. Say that 3 times fast. And then I'm employed by the South Carolina State Department of Education. So again, this sort of gives you the overview of how we got to this point and why we need some current updates. So increases in autism. So there's been a 9.5% increase in autism classifications, so not medical diagnosis, but classifications in schools since the time I gave this presentation, March 1st, 2019, and 2 years later. 2 years later. That's nationwide. In South Carolina specifically, the increase is 11%. In Georgia, just as a regional point of view, it's 17%. And there's been a lot more studies about the correlation between screen time and autism classifications. One in particular is related to the social communication questionnaire. And that what they found is that there's associations between the hours spent on screens and an SCQ score of 15 above, which suggests deficits in social skills. Same with the Childhood Autism Rating Scale. What they found there is that there is a positive correlation between the longer amount of screen time and the more obvious autistic symptoms. But let me explain why that is. It's because the longer they spend on screens, the less time they're interacting with other humans. And the less time they're interacting with other humans, the more deficit they see in the social behaviors because they haven't had a chance to practice them and use them. And then also then you see that in the results of the social deficits. There's also another study that talked about how the longer screen time for boys at age 1 And a huge point of this whole talk is about these critical stages of development. So screen time for boys of age 1 was significantly associated with autism spectrum disorder at 3. Now, to be clear, it's not to say autism is, or screen time is causing autism by any stretch, but this disproportionate exposure to screens during those critical periods of development can negatively impact social communication, how you develop that, how well you develop that, social emotional skills, and behavior. So this is why it's incredibly important to have our medical professionals really know, understand, and to share the impact of screen time on children's ability to develop optimally and helping guide them with that. So now let's look at this with the COVID impact. So this comes from what's called the LENA project, which if you're not familiar with the LENA project, it is an amazing resource to look into. Now, as a bit of context, the LENA project basically is a technology device that little people wear, and it's recording their words, their utterances, the parents' utterances. It's able to screen apart whether or not it's the parent talking versus the TV talking. It's really kind of an incredible thing. But what it essentially is an extension or a current use or replication of the Hart and Risley study. If you're not familiar with the Hart and Risley study, that was the study that looked at children from low socioeconomic status and said that if you're a low SES kid, there's a 30 million word gap between what you know and what you hear and your other peers. And that gap was predictive of their school achievement in 3rd grade. So essentially, the LENA project is now using our current technology. Think Alexa, think Siri, think all that other cool technology devices that we can now use to record all of the different conversations. So what they found, and this was looking at data from 2010 until I think the last ending date is like 2022 sometime, is that we are seeing not only are children vocalizing less and uttering less, but there are less conversational exchanges. Less conversational exchanges. The impact of which is this. The impact being that for kids who are 0 to age 3, there was a significant drop. And I think this has an arrow pointy thing. Oh, look, there it goes. Okay. Yes, so what you see here is this red bar, that's your average, and then this is in cognitive, and you see the drop there. Here's verbal, here's average, here's during COVID, there's that drop, and then also nonverbal. Now, for those of you who are wondering how they came up with this, they used the Mullins scale, because I know lots of y'all are probably going to be asking that. So that's for kids who were born during the pandemic. That drop is for kids born during the pandemic. But what about those kids who were age 1? These are kids who are now age 4, okay? Yes. So what we're seeing now is that there's a drop of roughly 2.5 standard deviations in the area of verbal. That's a 60 right there. And nonverbal. And then cognitive is not quite the same, but still, it's a significant impact. And all of that is due to conversational turn-taking. And that conversational turn-taking is what drives brain development. So what they found was that the language environment is what drives the brain development, which are the foundation for social emotional skills, executive functioning, and academic skills. And this includes kids who never got sick, and it's across all socioeconomic areas. So, oops, went backwards. All right, so again, we're talking about these critical periods of development. The development during the first 3 years. That's when the growth of the brain exceeds that rate of growth during any other period in life. And at this point in time, between birth and age 3, all learning takes place in a social context through our relationships with others. You cannot replicate that in any way. And so what you see here I'm starting to really dig this light thing. What you see here is that at 3 months, you see basically a lot of gray mush. You get to about 12 months, you see more of that white. That's the myelin. Until you get up here to about 24 months, and now it's very, very clear. You see a better picture of that. And so by the age of 3, the brain is about 80 to 85% complete. Now, what grows is not necessarily the brain cells, but the connections between the synapses. And that only happens in response to our environment, our interaction with other people, our interaction with our environment, and our physical interaction with objects, with blocks and toys and getting outside in the grass. Now, this isn't to say that it's not any, the age 4 to 5 isn't important. It is. But these first 3 years are critical. So what does this look like over time? And why is this important to pay attention to? Well, what you see here you go, good. What you see here is that all of these skills, what you see here are all of these skills that develop before they get to school. So in particular for me, I'm particularly interested in the yellow line, which is the language. What you see is the language. There's a huge jump in growth in that before they get to school, which is important because once they get to school, they got to know something to learn something. So they have to have a good understanding of vocabulary. They've got to be able to follow some simple directions, those kind of things. And so all of that should happen if we're not putting an obstacle in the way of development. So let's circle back to myelin and the obstacles we're putting in the way. So again, myelin, if you're not familiar, is basically the brain's white matter. And it's white because of the relatively high lipid fat content in the protein that creates that. But the brain cells that produce that cholesterol for myelination are very easily damaged due to all kinds of things, but in particular, overstimulation and understimulation. Overstimulation and understimulation. So that we're talking about both of those things that we've mentioned today so far, screen time and lack of conversational turn-taking. Now, so the ability to grow the brain in a way that makes things easy and efficient to do, that all comes from our environment, our conversational turns. But when we put an impairment in the way of that, an obstacle in the way of that, it doesn't grow. Now, real quick, before I skip to the next slide, for those of you who are not as familiar with talking about brain development, and if you're sharing this with parents, here's the way I like to explain this. And I don't see one up here, but there usually is. If you think of the cord that comes out of any electronic device, in particular your cell phone. How many of y'all get your cell phone and you plug it in, and eventually what happens at that little point right there at the tip? It starts to tear away, okay? And so once that starts to tear away, what's underneath it? A bunch of wires. Now, when that happens, and actually the charger in my car right now is exactly this. So what happens is as you have those wires exposed, that connection is not as efficient. In the case of my car, it doesn't work from time to time. So it's the same thing with myelin. It's covering up all of those different wires in order to help make those messages go across quickly and easily and efficiently. So, all right, so with that stimulation, we've got to make sure they're getting the right kind of stimulation and the right amount of stimulation, especially in those critical periods of development, because that is what is setting the stage. As we showed you before, that's what's setting the stage for the academic success. So good or bad, we've got to make sure that we're giving them what they need, and especially during those critical periods. So what they found, and this goes back to that longitudinal study, if you look at the scatter on the left side, oh, here we go. This, what you see is that, look at the blue lines down at the bottom. What they're showing is that there's a long-term impact. They basically measured these kids every 6 months, and this is what they found. What they found is that they're having they're not bouncing back. They're not bouncing back. They're not getting what they need in order to bounce back. And so what this is showing on the right is it's showing a slower rate of myelination development, of myelin development. And what they found was it was not due to differences in birth outcomes. It was not due to maternal health or stress. It was not due to SES. It was specifically due to the language environment, that interactive engagement with another person. So going back to conversational turn taking, again, it's not, as the Hart and Risley study found, it's not about the number of words heard. It's about the engagement, the joint attention, the social reciprocity with another human. That's what makes a difference. That's what is creating the myelination, because you don't get that myelination through passive activities. You only get that myelination occurring through active engagement by attending to and attending things to your environment. And this was echoed by another study in 2018. So this is a 2018 study by Romero, and it looked at specifically the impact of language environment on the neuroanatomy and later academic achievement. And again, what they found was the number of conversational turns, regardless of socioeconomic status, had significant impact on myelination and the development of the critical areas of the brain necessary to have good academic success later on. So what are conversational turns? Anybody here familiar with elephant and piggy? Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that. Yes, so as elephant and piggy are just demonstrating for us, conversational turns occur in a pair. So like Piggy says, Piggy? Yes, Gerald. That is a pair. So that is a conversational turn. And it has to occur within 5 seconds of it being initiated. All right, and what we're finding is that young children need to engage in at least 40 conversational turns per hour. Now, I just did this presentation at the Council for Exceptional Children, and we did an activity where we had to get in groups of 3. So 2 people were carrying on a conversation, and one person was doing the tally. And we set it for 5 minutes. And what we found was within 5 minutes, all of the adults were anywhere between 38 conversational turns and 65. So all that to say, 40 conversational turns is not hard to get to. Not at all, not even for a child. So now, what's wrong with when they don't have all these conversational turns? Well, we know that when kids aren't engaged in conversation, they don't hear all the words they need to know. When they don't hear those words they need to know, then when they get to school, they don't even recognize that they don't know these words. So even as the teacher is teaching, as I mentioned earlier, they don't have anything to connect that to. And so when they get to reading, what happens is they start to skip over the words they aren't familiar with, which then impacts comprehension. All of that due to all of the conversation they had during those critical periods of development. As it relates specifically to the vocabulary they're not getting through conversation, this goes back to the Matthew effect, which basically states that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So what we're looking at is look at this, at the end of pre-K, your average student gains about 3,440 words per day. Your bottom 25% gain about 1,000 less. But look at, by the end of 2nd grade, what happens. That's a big difference. And we know what the difference of vocabulary is in comprehension. Now, one thing that I think that's really important to point out here is the need for schools to provide that very systematic and explicit instruction in vocabulary. And that's just a little soapbox I stand on. All right, another reason that conversational turn taking is related to phonological long-term memory. Essentially, all phonological long-term memory is those words you have stored in your head. So if your parent has talked to you about asparagus, let's say you're walking around the grocery store and you're looking at all of the different things in the grocery store, talking about them. Let's say maybe you don't even eat asparagus, but they happen to see it and they use the word asparagus. That word gets stored in what's called your phonological long-term memory. If it's stored, words heard that are stored, once you get to them in reading, they're faster and easier to read. If you've not heard that word before, you're going to stumble through it. So let me give you an example of that. So here's 2 words, okay? Now, when you read the word on the green box, do you hear it in your head? That's because it's stored in your phonological long-term memory. So again, you have to have heard that word in order for it to do that. Now, what about the word in the orange box? What do you hear when you see that word? Right. If you've not heard it, it's not stored in that phonological long-term memory. Now, where this word came from, I was actually reading fiction, which I never do. I always read research. I'm that kind of nerd. But what this shows is this, I was reading a book. It's called Little Fires Everywhere. I wanted to read the book before it came on TV. And I came across this word, and I went, a word I don't know. I need to see what this is. Like, what is my process? Like, I was really trying to think about it as a brand new reader. What do we do? What do we go through? What's the process we use to try and figure out unfamiliar words? And what happens is you go through and you do read it by chunks. So this is how I approached it. So I knew ner from neurology. So I said, is it neurasthenic, 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 neurasthenic? You have to play around with the word. You have to play around with the sound symbol association. You have to take what you know, such as the Greek and Latin roots. So I knew this was a medical term. Oops. So I knew that TH was probably going to be a T versus a TH sound. So you have to apply all of that. Now, consequently, I did see that word again later on in the book. And it was equally difficult, a little faster, but equally difficult to read again, as opposed to if I saw cafeteria and I'd heard it and I went through it all again. So, conversational turns and reading. So, conversational turns at the age of 2 correlate with pre-literacy skills, such as letter identification and letter sound knowledge at age 5, and myelin density, which we've talked about. And it happens in very specific areas of the brain that we use for reading. You know what those areas of the brain are? They're your language areas, because there's no single place in the brain wired for reading. Instead, it's the language areas that we talk about, what's called the speech to print connection. All of the areas of language that you use are the same that you use for reading. The only difference is if you're actually reading it, then you're also adding that modality of vision, which then incorporates another part of your brain. But if you're blind, you're using a completely different modality. You're using your tactile modality. So that's why we like to say that whether it's spoken or written, it's all language. So the better we know and appreciate language, the better we can teach written language. So, what's important to know too is reading, unlike math or science, reading is the only academic skill where we expect them to come to school with a certain set of skills. So we don't start, in math, we start teaching them one-to-one correspondence. But when they start school, we assume that they have phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, that they have some level of rhyme, that they have enough vocabulary. We assume that. And so there's a great deal of, that's again why it's so important to make sure they have that competency with language once they start school. And here's some data specific to what's called the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment. Now, I don't know if all of you are from this state or not, but the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment is a test that we give to children beginning in kindergarten. Beginning in kindergarten. So a lot of times they actually test kids like a few days before school starts. They have them come in, they get familiar with the teacher in the classroom, and the idea is to say, what are we dealing with when kids come to school? Well, what we found is that in our state, statewide, in 2021, only 27% of students demonstrated readiness. Everyone else needed either some support or significant amounts of support in order to access the academic standards. Think about that. They need some support or significant support just to access the standards. Now, the year before that, it was 39%. It was 39% achieved demonstrating readiness. Now it's 27%. Now, for kids who completed the 10-week LENA project program, it's 10 weeks, And they take parents through teaching them talking tips and teaching them about conversational turns. They show them the data about that's been collected through that little technology device that really looks at how much conversation they're having. Those kids who completed that 10-week program, 33.3% demonstrated readiness. But our kids who were in 4K, a whole year of 4K, how many of them achieved demonstrating readiness? 23%. That's the difference conversation makes. And there's longitudinal data to support that as well. What the LENA project has gathered is that children who engaged in at least those 40 conversational turns during those critical periods, 18 to 24 months, had full-scale IQ scores an average of 31 percentile points higher, verbal scores that were 38 percentile points higher than those who engaged in fewer conversational turns. So again, this is looking at it longitudinally down the road. Why is that? Because while the genes provide a blueprint for brain development, it's the child's environment and their experiences that carry out the construction. And conversation is that raw material for building that language-rich environment. Now, let's talk about screens, conversation, and parents. Because it's not just looking at the student time or the child's time on devices, but also parents. So we assume that the home is where all of these conversations are taking place. But 95% of parents report that their tech use interferes with their conversation with their children. So we know it's a problem. They know it's a problem. And in part, a big problem with it is because not just the conversational turns, but also what we refer to as continuous partial attention. How many of y'all have ever been to dinner or on a date or anywhere at a restaurant and you're with someone, one other person, and that person is on their phone? So you're not just at dinner with that person, you're at dinner with that person and everybody he knows on Snapchat or whatever TigerNet group he happens to be reading. Not saying that's a personal experience at all. Yes, actually it is. Anyway, but when you have that, how do you feel? It's not a good feeling, and young children can't express what that is or why that's a problem. And this continuous partial attention interferes with our most primitive emotional cueing system that's based on responsive communication. And what happens with that is you have an adult that is physically present with you, but emotionally disconnected. Let me say that again. When that happens, that child has an adult that is physically present, but emotionally disconnected, which sends what message? The device is more important than they are. The device is more important than they are. Now, and on to what happens when they then go, okay, well, I'm trying to get your attention. Do they do that usually in the most productive ways? No, they never do. They never walk up and go, Mommy, you've been on your phone too long. It's my turn. They don't do that. They usually throw something off a counter or hit baby sister or whatever. So what happens is you have this perfect storm of not going to be ending well. Now, what about conversation at school? How many of us assume that they're having lots of great conversations at school? We have data on that too. What it shows is that the majority of children in the United States do attend preschool, and it's for the majority of their awake hours. So this is their language environment, okay? But the data is showing that kids who are in like a home-based child care environment, they have 73% more conversational turns than if they're in a traditional early childhood child care environment. That's a lot. Now, again, think about it. This is when it is during their critical periods of development. So we're also seeing that 20% of kids are in language isolation. Language isolation. They're getting less than 5 turns per hour for the vast majority of their day. And this is even if you've got a classroom full of talking kids, but not for that kid. Then we're also finding that most children experience about 40% of their conversational turns and interactions within actually just 1 hour of the day. But beyond that one single hour, 2/3 of kids experience less than 15 conversational turns per hour. And so what this leads up to is now we're talking about the vocabulary gap or the word gap not being based on what's at home, but what's at school, what's in those early childhood environments. So let's talk about technology during the school day, because I don't think we give this enough attention at all. What we're finding in the 2014 data was the most recent that I could find, but what we're finding is that in preschool, early childhood care settings, kids are getting about 1.5 hours per day in front of a screen. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 1 hour a day. So that's the amount of time they're getting at school. And do you think they're probably getting screen time after that as well? You betcha. Now, center-based early childhood care reports rates of 1.3 hours of screen time per day. 90% of early childhood teachers report that they have access to technology and use it frequently, and 20% of that is on a tablet, 27% on a computer, 5% on a smartphone. So all of this I want to share because, again, we've got to circle back to creating that architecture of the brain that's ready to learn, that's going to be academically successful, that makes those connections between speech to print. So, again, myelin forms based on meaningful, engaged experiences. But the Journal of American Medical Association notes that for kids in preschool, age 3 to 5, not yet starting kindergarten, when they engage in less play, and they exceed those American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations for no more than an hour a day, there's less myelination that supports language, that supports emergent literacy, and those corresponding cognitive assessments. In other words, it's not if there's an impact, we know there's an impact. So here's a good example. This is the brain of a preschooler who is read to often by a caregiver. So here we go. These red areas of the brain, what you're seeing here is that that's very organized myelination, very organized white matter in those language and literacy areas of the brain that then support academic success. On the other hand, this is the brain of a preschooler who spends an average of 2 hours a day playing on 2 hours, spending on screens. And what you see is a massive underdevelopment and disorganization of that white matter in those same areas. This comes from Children's Hospital of Cincinnati, and it's the first study that actually provides that neurological evidence for the potential benefits of reading and the potential detriments of screen time in preschool. Now, here's what parents are going to say. Once you start talking about this, what they're going to ask you is they're going to say, well, what about educational apps? There's all kinds of educational apps. What about those? Well, there's no evidence to say that, or most of them don't have any evidence whatsoever that they actually help improve anything. So, for example, there's apps that have them tracing letters. There's apps that have them counting 1 to 10. There's apps that do all kind of things, but that doesn't mean it's transferable. So if you have a child who's able to trace an A on the screen, that does not, anybody in here know T? That has nothing to do with whether or not they can achieve a tripod grasp to actually write the letter A. And so what we're finding in schools, kids are great at this, they're horrible at this. Not only that, but in schools where teachers in kindergarten are having to start out saying, this is a crayon, this is how you hold it. These are scissors, this is how you use them. That's the impact that we're seeing. So again, those educational apps, really, number one, they're not designed for a dual audience, meaning we're not interacting, we're not engaged when we're doing them. So it's a very passive experience. And what you need to really be thinking about is, how are these skills best achieved? How are these skills best learned? Which are through play and through that responsive parent-child interaction. So essentially what I like to tell people is that screens are really what I refer to as mental junk food. So I like to use this comparison, especially for parents. And I actually have a good friend just like this. She's all about the organic foods and going to get the organic strawberries that haven't been sprayed with the whatevers, but her child's on screen all day. So while she's filling their body with appropriate things that will help support healthy development, the brain is not being fed with those things that will support healthy development. And what happens is you just can't see the impact yet. Yet. It's coming, but they can't see it yet. So again, what we know is that even it's both the introduction of screens and the amount of times on screens. So screen use before the age of 2 had significantly less emotional functioning scores, higher risk of conduct problems, learning problems, psychosomatic problems, impulsive hyperactive, and this was independent, completely separate from how much time they spent. It was just that introduction. So it's just that exposure. In terms of amount, for kids spending more than an hour a day on screens prior to kindergarten, again, those critical periods of development, they're more vulnerable in all 5 areas of development. So again, we have to think about it in terms of this is an obstacle that's being put in the way of appropriate development. So what are we looking at? How much time are kids actually spending on screens? Well, what you see here is that 2-year-olds in the United States have less than an hour on average. 2 to 4-year-olds have an average of 2.5 hours daily. 5 to 8-year-olds have little more than 3 hours. Now, what's important to point out, trying to get my fancy button. There it is, right here. So number 1, these red lines, that's the amount of time recommended by the American Pediatrics. And this is all that above. How much time is being spent above that? So again, I want you to really focus on how much of an increase. It's a 3-fold increase from 12 months to 3 years. And that's what we see with that yellow area. So what are the recommendations? Well, you have them here. So under the age of 2, okay, up to about 18 months, the only time they should be on a screen is when they're engaged with other people. So when they're video chatting, say dad's out of work, and so they're video chatting with dad. For 2.5, it's no more than 1 hour a day. 5 to 8, it's 1 to 1.5 hours a day, and that recommendation. But I want you to think about this for a second, especially during these critical periods. Any of y'all seen Coco Melon? Here's the problem with Coco Melon, and we can use the same argument for Baby Einstein. Baby Einstein had scene changes that were every 7 seconds. Every 7 seconds, the screen changed. So it's shifting their attention to something else. Coco Melon is every 3 seconds. Every 3 seconds. And it's not even until the age of around 18 months that the brain understands that they see a cat or whatever that green thing is, I guess it's a turtle, that turtle on the screen equates to that turtle that's in the aquarium on their counter. They don't have that ability. And children 12 months and younger, they can't follow the changing scenes because they don't have the vocabulary to understand it. So what is keeping them engaged? The hyperstimulation. The exciting colors, the quick scene changes, the music, the beeps, the sounds, the over-exaggerated characters. So that leads me to talk a little bit about the visual and vestibular system. Essentially, it's being created during those critical periods of development. And so what happens is when they're getting acclimated to this fast pace of visual information coming in, guess what happens? They get used to that fast pace of visual information coming in. The other thing that happens, and I'm sure you have all seen this and experienced it, what happens when we take that screen away? Total tantrum. Do you know why that is? The reason that is because what happens is the visual system is very closely linked with the vestibular system. So when you think vestibular, think rocking. When you rock your baby to sleep, is that calming? Same thing, how many of you had to drive your baby from time to time just so they would fall asleep? That's also linear. All right, now let's think the rotational. Okay, think the teacups. Is that calming? The teacups at Disney, is that calming? I can't even get on it now. We go every year, and I skip it every year. So what's happened is, while the visual system is really super hyper-focused on all that's going on, the vestibular system is completely shut down. So they go from super hyper-focused to super unfocused like that. And it doesn't matter whether or not you've given them a 5-minute warning. It's the way the brain is reacting to the stimuli. So, how bad can a few Baby Shark videos be, really? Well, every hour spent watching a baby video, the child learns 6 to 8 fewer words than if they never watched videos. Toddlers exposed to handheld screens were more likely to have language delays, such that for every 30 minutes of screen time per day, there was a 2.3 times increased risk of language delay. Again, language, spoken language, written language. And children who watch videos before the age of 3 are more likely to have attention problems, and for every hour per day, there's a 10% risk of attention problems. So at 2 hours a day, 20%. 3 hours a day, 30%. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. We all rely on technology, and technology is not going anywhere. So we need to make sure we're equipping people with the knowledge. I truly and fundamentally believe that parents are not giving kids screens just because they know it's going to be bad for them. No, I truly believe it's that they don't know better, and they don't know what the implications can be. But I wanted to also point out this data here. Here's this one. In 2020, 46% of kids aged 2 to 4 had their own mobile device. Why does a 2-year-old need their own mobile device? Yes. And do you think that number is higher or lower in 2023? So I bring this to now, what can we do? The main thing is play. We've got to bring back play. Like we're bringing sexy back. We got to bring play back. Because play is something we take for granted, okay? It's developmentally appropriate play is the singular opportunity to promote social, emotional, cognitive, language, self-regulation, all of those things that build executive function, and a pro-social, social brain that's ready to learn. That all occurs through play. It's so important that the South Carolina standards, look what the #1 domain of the South Carolina early learning standards are. Play. Play. And those dimensions of play are the exact same ones that we need for reading comprehension. Okay? So all of these academic skills, we start off learning them through play, including make-believe, such as believing that a pigeon could actually drive a bus. So make-believe is what we need to be helping kids to engage in, because that's also going to help them with problem solving. And problem solving occurs across all curricular areas. So play is so powerful, it can be used as a possible intervention to close the achievement gap between kids aged 3 to 6. But we're seeing play disappear. Where you're sitting right now is Greenville County. Greenville County School District has done away with dramatic play centers in kindergarten. They're gone. And they are not the only district in South Carolina that has done that. What they're doing is they're replacing them with literacy centers, not realizing what the impact is, which is why I present this to every district that I can as often as I can. So what we found was that and this is a late number, 1998 to 2010, dramatic play dropped from 90% in classrooms to 58%. It's significantly less now. And what they're doing is their thought is, well, if we give them all this literacy play centers, they play with all these letters and put them together and stuff, that will help. They're missing what the core foundational information is here, which is the language that you get from play. Same thing with tech toys. Okay, you'll talk to a lot of early interventionists. This is the same thing they see. What happens is when you have a device that is talking for the child, guess what it's doing? It's talking for the child. So the child doesn't have to use as many words, and the parent also doesn't have to engage and supply those words. Now, when was the last time you tried to buy a gift for a young child? I have a nephew that turned 1 in November. I had a really hard time finding the old school toys. Actually, funny story, I'll tell you what I actually did buy. They actually had, the little Fisher-Price squatty body people? They had the Rolling Stones. And his mom is a big fan of the Rolling Stones. So that's what I went with. All right, it's also impacting executive function development. And executive function development is critical for being ready to be in a group of other children for learning. And what we find is that there's a huge burst in this around the age of 3. These components of executive function are critically important to, again, engaging with others, but also to reading. So problem solving, perspective taking, multitasking, and big one here, social, emotional, and impulse control. And I will tell you without question, if you are in a school setting right now, woo, the social, emotional, and the impulse control, the behavior in general, is a huge impediment to being able to teach kids to learn across all grade levels. And children are not born with these skills. They are born with the potential to develop them from their environment. And I will tell you, the one thing that sticks out to me when I gave this presentation March 1st, 2019 was, after this presentation, I had a pediatrician come up to me and tell me that when children go for their shots, they get the shot, and then they cry, of course. Instead of holding and calming and comforting the child, they give them the phone. So they're not learning how to self-calm through a model. So executive function is so important that, again, when we look at the domains for learning, guess what is part of every single one? Executive function. So what are some of my recommendations? Well, the first one is a digital diet. So just like I was using that comparison to mental junk food, sometimes we need to go on a diet to get rid of the junk food. So you can go on a digital diet. And so my recommendations for that are, number one, know what the recommendations are. Know what the recommendations are. So this slide deck is provided to y'all as a handout, but I also shared with them a little trifold brochure that has a lot of this information. So I'm not sure how you access all of those things, but I did provide it because I'm not a big fan of just coming and spewing stuff and then saying good luck. I wanted to give you something that you could share. There you go. And then to understand the why. Why is this important? How does this impact their academic success? To set up tech-free times and locations, the number one being dinner time, mealtime, anytime, and in the car. But what do we see happening? I knew as soon as they started putting screens in those Honda Odysseys that the day was coming, that it was going to be impactful. And yes, most definitely, here we are. I had a little child that I was seeing for private speech therapy, and he was barely verbal. He was 3 years old. He was probably speaking 2-word phrases maybe. We'd worked so hard. Oh my gosh, we did everything we could. And then as soon as they left, they put on the screen in the car. So I had to talk to the mom and say, let's think about a different way to do this. Let's think about something else that we can be doing in the car. Another big one, especially when they get a little older, is be the one in charge of the controller, the charger. That's you. You can set that up. Also, make sure you're using timers. Set the phone to grayscale, then it's less hyperstimulating. Look for those red flags. The red flag being, if you can't get them off of the device without a tantrum, there's a problem. That's your red flag. And then 2, use the device for meaningful things you can engage with them. So if you're gonna watch Baby Shark, get off it afterwards and then sing Baby Shark with them, without the screen. But don't use it for those repetitive passive activities. Also for parents, when should they be on their phone or not on their phone? Well, an easy recommendation is to ask them, would you be reading a book at this time? So for example, would you be reading a book at, let's say, a stoplight? No, you wouldn't, so don't be on your phone then. Would you be reading a book while your infant is in the bathtub? No, so that's not a good time to be on your phone then either, okay? So basically let that be sort of an easy way for them to make those connections. Teachers, reminding teachers that conversation is gold. That is our most efficient learning system that we have. It's more valuable than the reading curriculum that we have right now. There's a meta-analysis that was just on 13 early childhood literacy programs, and all of them failed to find any evidence of effects on language and print-based outcomes. What makes the difference? Conversation, building that language. So my key takeaways for you, so I'll make sure and leave time for questions, is number one, conversational turns, that language environment. Regardless of SES, and when I say regardless of SES, you and I both know that there are kids who live in poverty, who have a grandma, an aunt, a brother or sister or whatever, who talks their ear off, who sings to them all day long, who takes them around on the gator or whatever, and they talk about everything that they see while they're riding out in the woods. By the same token, you also have those high SES kids who go from watching videos while they get ready, to in the car, watching videos on the way to school, to being at school, probably getting videos there, as we saw from the data, to getting back in the car, screens on again, back home on video games. So that's why we say, regardless of SES. Also know, it is now well known that screen use during critical periods of development and for periods of in excess by those of the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's a detrimental impact on brain development in all areas of development. The last two key takeaways are play. Play and learning are inextricably intertwined. Okay, when children play, they learn. And when they play, they learn and they do better academically. And again, it's not that screen time causes autism spectrum disorder, but it puts an obstacle in the way of appropriate development of social communication and social emotional skills that are necessary for interacting with other humans. So the last few things that you'll see, which I'm not going to go over, I just wanted you to have as a reference, were what are some tips for facilitating play? So this is a big thing when I talk with teachers in particular. It's not about sending kids out to go play. It's about playing with them, getting down in the mix with them, and facilitating that play. So there's tips for that. A few tips for say this, not that. So I vividly remember in graduate school, I had to learn not to ask yes, no questions. Because what happens when you ask a 4-year-old if they want to go to speech and they say no? What are you going to do now? You got nothing. So it's really about learning to ask those open-ended questions and questions that lead to more language from the child. A big favorite is instead of saying, how was your day? Because what's your child going to say? Fine. Say, tell me 3 things about your day. So that's a good tip for that. There's a few more talking tips. The first 2 I really want to talk about, especially if you're working with young children, is number 1, talk about what you're doing. How many of y'all watch cooking shows? I don't watch them. I'm trying to think. Who's the pioneer lady? All right, while the pioneer lady, what's her name? Who knows who that is? Ree Drummond, there you go. While Ree Drummond is demonstrating how she makes her fried chicken, she's talking through and explaining everything she's doing. When you do that, you're providing that model for language that they then can absorb and start to use themselves. So that's one thing you can do. The second thing you can do is you can be a golf announcer or sports announcer. We just happen to have golf on at our house a lot. And what is the golf announcer doing? He's narrating everything that everybody else is doing. But it's the same thing. You're getting that language across. You're getting that language down into their brain. So the rest are pretty self-explanatory. So we have 5 minutes left for questions. All right, what questions do you have? Or what else you want to know from a speech-language pathologist? I'll tell you this. We are having right now in our state, when we talk about preschool and development, yeah, go ahead and come down. When we're talking about preschool and development, we have 3 times the number of referrals now at this point in time than we did last year. 3 times as many.
Do you attribute that to COVID and masking?
Here's the thing with the masking. If they weren't masked, let's say if they were masked or if they weren't masked, they still can hear the information. And they're still at home with parents who are not masked. So we're not attributing it from a speech standpoint. Now, if it was a disordered production, that would be one thing. Like if they're saying for that may be related to how they see it and then how they hear it. But in terms of overall language and developmental delay across the board, that most certainly does not account for it. It's the conversational turn. It's the language environment. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So as a pediatrician, I want you to come talk to all of us. I'm going to figure out some kind of conference for you to come to. But now I'm just forgetting what I was going to say. Oh, one of my partners recently, we had a Reach Out and Read, Lunch and Learn.
Yeah.
And we have books in our office that have no words, and it's the baby's like high contrast books. And he said, those books have no words. I mean, how are they supposed to read those books? And it was such an interesting comment to me because I thought, they don't get it. Like,
Right,
this
exactly.
is not, so things that I think we take for granted, we really need to talk to parents about. But my question for you is, so the cat's out of the bag.
Yes.
You know, I get with parents, oh, my 4-year-old is already addicted to the phone, and
Yes.
they truly are addicted.
And they do have that as a DSM code now, too.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do you tell them about?
So, and we see this even with children who we're now trying to get them to use assistive technology. We have to deprogram them. We have to completely take them off of screens and reprogram their brain to be able to use it in a meaningful way. So we have to take them off, and it's going to be rough, but it'll be a lot harder when they're 8, 10, 12, 16 down the road. So that would be my recommendation. The other question I get a lot is from parents who have children who are on the autism spectrum, and they say, well, they're using the videos as a form of STEM. Can they still do that? Well, my response is, how well are they able to transition off of it? If you can't transition off of it without a tantrum, it's not helping. It's not a helpful STEM. So we need to find something different. Does that help? Does that answer it? Okay. What other questions do you have? Yes?
Data for older children, like high school.
Yes, there's definitely a lot of data for older children. I did not include that for this presentation because I knew it was for geared more toward the younger audience. But what they're finding, and you know this, if you have teenagers, you know exactly what this is. We're seeing a lot more depression, anxiety. Again, it's related to what they're doing with the phone, how much time they're spending on the phone. And essentially, it's how much time they're spending in an alternate reality, a reality that actually does not exist. And then also, too, the impact of what they're hearing and seeing about themselves from peers. So yeah, there's a lot of data on older children. If you're really interested, Common Sense Media, where the data that I gave on the amount of use, Common Sense Media has a great deal of information on that topic in particular. Yes.
Any information on bilingual kids with screens? Because we've seen from time to time that there's also like a developmental delay in speech when you have parents speaking maybe two languages. So how is the impact also adding the screen?
So I am a huge proponent of making sure we're addressing the bilingual, multilingual, and dialectical variations. And I do a lot of talk on that. Now, as it relates specifically to a student or a child who is in a language that's, or they live in a home where there's a different language, it's really not about whether or not that is the impact. It's really about, because they can learn English and they can learn certain words. But again, it's related to that overstimulation. So if they're using that device, even if it's appropriate, because that would be engaging, that would be helpful, that would be meaningful, how are they then using it meaningfully with their parents? So that they can then take that information and generalize it outside of just that context of the iPad or the tablet or whatever. So, and again, the same holds true. If that becomes overstimulating and they can't transition off of it, that's your red flag. One more minute. One more quick question.
Just say it loud.
Yeah.
Okay. So things like shows like Miss Rachel. Like Miss Rachel gets a lot of praise, I guess, from speech therapists because her programs are more interactive. Is that what are your thoughts on?
So her question is about how interactive Miss Rachel is. So here's my question. Is that being generalized outside of the screen? So are they taking that same interaction they're doing with the screen and then using it to interact with other children and adults? That's what you want to be looking for. And again, the same holds true if they get hyperstimulated and overstimulated from Miss Rachel. That's not a good thing. And again, it goes back to how much time are they spending on that? Nobody needs to watch Miss Rachel for 3 hours a day. Okay.
Friends, let's get a round of applause for Angie and all that amazing information. That was so helpful.